the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light." And God separated the light from the darkness. And he saw that the light was good. Then he separated the waters of the earth, creating the skies and seas. The earth brought forth vegetation, and God saw that it was good. And God made two great lights. Then he made the animals. Then he created you.
Amen. Well, one of the things that we've seen over the past couple weeks is that we've begun to see how the Bible is filled with verses that call us to be able to look forward to creation, because creation is a way that God has revealed himself. We can look to creation and we can see God. And therefore, it's not only the study of nature, it's the study of science. Let me take you, for example, to a passage in Job. If you go to Job chapter 12, look what it says. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of God has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. And so what is it saying? Just look to creation. Look at science, because all these declare that God has done this. They declare his glory. So this morning we're going to spend a lot of time looking at science. And in science we're going to see how God has revealed himself through his creation. We're going to see how the evidence of science, again, is totally inconsistent with the idea of evolution, Darwinistic evolution, but instead it points us towards God. I'm going to tell you, we're going to look at this week and next week, we're going to be a lot into science. We're going to say that you're going to start calling me Pastor Mike, the science guy. In fact, I'll tell you, even next week, we might even have a new intro to this series with Pastor Mike, the science guy. So you got to come back and see that next week. But as we dive into the study for today, what I want to do is that I want to start by, again, reaffirming a couple principles that are at the core of everything that we're saying, that we've been laying out here in the last couple weeks. What we're doing is we're trying to recognize that what is the understanding or correlation between faith and science. You see, there are many who believe in evolution who will come back and say, well, if you believe in creation, well, you are anti-science. And that's often the way it's presented. And a lot of times I've even talked to Christians who believe, well, I believe the Bible says this, but I know that disagrees with science. Well, no, that's not the case. This little cartoon, again, reflects, we showed this in the first week, it reflects what is often said, that the scientific method, well, here are the facts, and what conclusions can we draw? And the creationist method, well, here's the conclusions. How can we fit the facts to support it? That's often the way that it's presented. But what we're seeing, and what we're going to see even more today, is that the opposite is actually what's true. It's the evolutionists that say, well, we're starting with our conclusion. And in spite of the evidence, how can we somehow ignore most of the evidence and find a few things that somehow agree with what we already have concluded? And it's the creationist that says, no, well, because we believe that God created all things, we can look to the evidence of science and it's going to affirm everything that we believe. Now, one of the reasons that we run into this is because people try to say that there's a division between scientific and religious truth. And again, we've talked about this a lot in the first week of this. But there is no division between scientific and religious truth. Some people will argue, no, that religion is one kind of truth. Well, that's a matter of faith. And science is another kind of truth. That's a matter of fact. That's a matter of evidence. And so they will say that, that there's two different kinds. One is what is determined by your belief and sincerity. The other is determined by your mind and by fact. And again, we spent a lot of time the first week if you want to go deeper with this. But what we want to, go back to that message. But I want to try to say that, no, that's not at all the case. What we need to remember is that creation, that truth is truth. And the evolutionists will say, well, if you're saying, yeah, I believe in creationism, what they do is that they use this idea of the division of different kinds of truth as a way of rejecting not only the argument, but all the evidence. So I've been in multiple debates where you have a creationist and evolutionist, and the creationist starts talking, well, I believe that God created. And they say, well, no, that's a religious statement. And therefore, because you bring God into the picture, that's religion, and that's totally separated. So now you're not only allowed to argue for that statement, none of the evidence that you bring in counts because you're trying to prove a religious truth of God, not a scientific truth. But again, what we've seen is that evolution, likewise, is not just a scientific theory, it's a worldview. It's literally a religious view. It's a belief about where we came from and what's ultimate reality and where we're going. And not only that, but we've seen that likewise, that when we talk about creation, that's not just religious, that's science and history as well. Because the principle we need to remember is that all truth is always absolute truth. And that's vital to recognize. That all truth is absolute truth. Why? Because truth is something that conforms to ultimate reality. It conforms to the real world. And if something is true in one aspect of life, then it's going to be true in every aspect of life, including religion. And so if something is true in religion, if there is a God, he exists, that's a truth. It's not only religious, it's historical, it's scientific, it's moral, it's everything about it. And if God actually created, that's something that happened historically in time. And what we're going to find is that the evidence of science is going to affirm that because it's true. And therefore it conforms to reality. But on the other hand, when you look at statements about evolution, that's a statement, again, not just of science. It's saying, here's what I believe is true about God, that there is no God, that ultimate reality is matter. And it's a statement they're trying to make a statement about religion, about morality, about science, about all these things. So when we look at this, what we find is that the Bible calls us to recognize that since all truth is truth, the Bible calls us, yes, to a faith, but it's a faith that's rooted in fact. Since all truth is truth in every area, that when you look at the Bible makes any claim in any area, it's going to be true across the board. People often talk about faith as the idea of a leap into the dark, that it's something that we're supposed to just believe. Here's what the Bible says. I close my eyes and I just step out in faith and hope it's true. But the Bible never calls us to turn off our mind in order to believe. The Christian faith is always called to be rooted in truth. And the Bible goes to great lengths to repeatedly demonstrate that everything that is written in the Bible is factually true. It doesn't call us to blind faith. That's what we saw last week in 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter says this, "But in your hearts honor Christ as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, yet do so with gentleness and respect." It's not just a blind faith. It's a faith that is able to make a defense, that's able to say, here's why I believe what I believe. Here's the reasonableness. Here's the truthfulness. It's not a leap into the dark. It's, shall we say, a step toward the light. Last week we used a clip from the Indiana Jones Last Crusade because I think it illustrates it so well. If you're here last week, it's not that picture where his eyes are telling him there's nothing there and he steps out in faith into a blind chasm hoping that he will be supported. That's not biblical faith. Biblical faith is what he did when he got to the other side. He picked up all this dirt and he threw it out and he saw the outline of this bridge. He still didn't see the bridge. He saw the outline. And so faith is still putting our trust in what we cannot see. You see, but it's a faith that is consistent with logic and reason. It goes beyond those things, but it's consistent with logic and reason. Now, there are many that will believe in evolution that will say, well, you need faith. We don't need faith. We just have facts. But again, what we've seen is that evolution, those who believe in a Darwinistic view of evolution, is not just a scientific view. It's a worldview that ultimately must be accepted by faith. See, it calls itself science. But in reality, the strong supporters of evolution defend it not by appealing to science, but appealing to scientism. And scientism is the belief that the only thing that is science, or that should be considered as science, is the material world which we can test and see and manipulate. And so what that does is that says, well, true science excludes the possibility that there might be anything outside of science, that there is anything, could be anything supernatural. But again, that's not a scientific idea. It's not something that can be proven. That's a religious statement. It's a worldview, because it makes these huge assumptions about reality, about ultimate reality, where things came from, why we're here, where we're going. And so therefore, it's as a religion, it likewise is a statement that they have to take on faith. It can't be proven. You can't prove that there is no God, just as I can prove there is a God. That ultimately it has to be accepted. Now the question is, when we throw out the facts of evidence, when we throw out the dirt, what is more consistent with what we know? And that's what we have to ask, is do the facts of science support the claims of evolution or creation? Do the facts of science we can throw out? Now I can't prove there is a God, you can't prove there isn't a God. And so if we start with the possibility that there might be, there might not be, let's throw out the facts and let's see which one stands. Let's see where the outline of the bridge is and where it all falls. And that's what we're going to be doing. This morning we're going to focus again very heavily on one question, and that's the origin of life. See, when Darwin first proposed his theory, what he believed is that his whole theory is that you start with the simple and you go to the complex. So he believed that at the very beginning, that life was very, very simple. They didn't understand the cell very well, so they looked at the cell without electronic microscopes, and they believed that it was just a blob of protoplasm, that had a few different parts consisting of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. In fact, this was actually pretty common until the 1950s, until they developed the electronic microscope. And so what he believed is that since the cell was very simple, it was very easy for it to spontaneously, for life to spontaneously start. Because it was just a few different pieces. But what happened is that over time, now we've learned more about the cell. We've developed the ability to look into it in ways that never could have been dreamed. And I want to tell you, the more that I look into it, the more I'm amazed. I think you'll be amazed. We're going to see this morning that the evidence of science beautifully agrees with the creation story. Its amazing complexity declares the glory of our wondrous Creator. It teaches that the Bible teaches what God not only created every cell, that it's designed, but that He holds it together. It speaks in terms of the detail. I think of Colossians chapter 1, where it says this: For by him all things were created, in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Verse 17, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's saying that God is involved in the very details. There's things like cells that we don't even understand. But God not only created those things, but He's holding it all together now. See, what we're going to see is that as we look at the detail, the cell evolution doesn't have an answer for the detail. And we're going to see that even the supporters of evolution are forced to admit that when it comes to the question of origin of life, it's impossible. And they're forced to believe the impossible in spite of all the evidence that says that this could not have happened. So let's look at it. Let's look at the evidence. And let's ask this question: which one is a reasonable faith? Which one of us, creation or evolution, which one of us has a faith that is consistent with the facts, that is consistent with reason, and which one of us just has to say, well, I have my agreement, and my conclusion, I'm going to close my eyes and believe it in spite of what I see. Now, to look at this, let me first of all even think about this in terms of the first point about Darwin. And Darwin himself gave us a standard by evaluating his own theory. Remember, Darwin's theory is that the simple life started simple, and that simple life could then, because it's so simple, could happen by accident, and then the processes of nature and of evolution would somehow allow that simple over great time to be complex. But in chapter 6 of his book, On Origin of Species, I want you to look at what Darwin says about his own theory and how to evaluate it and what would destroy his theory. Chapter 6, this is what he says: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And I want you to see what he's saying. What he's saying is you cannot start with the complex. And if science proves that there's complexity that could not have evolved over time from the simple, if there's anything that starts complex and could not have started from this theory, my theory breaks down, and basically Darwin is himself saying, if that's proven, you have to reject my theory as wrong. That's what he's saying. Okay, so now let's look at the simplest part of life. Let's look at the simple single-cell organism. The thing that at that time that he thought was just protoplasm. And let's look at it. What have we learned about the single-cell organism? I think you're going to see incredible, amazing complexity. So over the past 70 years, what we've found is through the electronic microscope, that the cell is anything but a simple blob of protoplasm. It's something that is incredibly complex. It's something that is, not just a, kind of stuff floating around. It actually is made up of, packed full of machines. These machines that were so small that we couldn't see until a couple generations ago. Even now, you just look at this idea, this little thing, 10 million atoms are here. And it has all these different machines, all these different parts that are each one doing incredible things. Now, I can try to explain this to you, and I'm not going to be very good at it, because although I pretend to be Pastor Mike, the science guy, I'm really just Pastor Mike, and I know a little bit about science, but not at this level. And even if I could explain it, I would probably confuse you. So you know what I'm going to do is I found a little video that explains a little bit about the complexity of the cell. And this is just a little bit of the complexity of the cell. And I want you to realize this is what they're saying was so simple it could happen by accident. Look what we have learned now through science.
Science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, It is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design.
Now, when you look at that, again, I'm not going to give you a test on that. I don't know if any of us could remember any of it. But what I hope that you see, isn't God amazing? Now let's go back and remember Darwin. Darwin said in his own book, here's how to evaluate whether my theory is true. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. If that's demonstrated, you should reject my theory. And now what we find is the most simple life, that single cell. That's what this most simple single cell looks like. Now, is that simple or is that incredibly complex? And so we look at this, and the evidence of science is screaming and declaring that it has been designed by God. It is driving us towards God. Now, believe it or not, the problem for an evolutionist actually gets more complex. The problems get harder because it's not only the incredible design of the cell that you say, how could that have, that couldn't have evolved. It had to all come together at once. Because unless all those machines all came together at once and functioned, a cell couldn't live. You need all of that for the cell to live. A single cell. But it's not only the machines. You see, all the machines that he talked about there are all, the basic building block of the life is the cell. Well, the building block of the cell is proteins. It's proteins that are the building block of all of life. And so you're looking at it, not only how do those machines come, but how in the world did the proteins form so that they could build the machines? Now, the theory of Darwinism is that there were these chemicals that existed in some sort of water, often referred to as primordial soup. And then lightning struck this water, and it somehow caused these chemicals to combine and spontaneously create life. Again, that complex life. This is called chemical evolution. And now some people have tried to simulate this in labs. There was a very famous experiment in the 1950s where people tried to put all the right chemicals in and hit it with lightning. And they did form a couple amino acids, not proteins, a couple amino acids. Now, first of all, that experiment was one done in ideal circumstances. It was more about design than by chance. Evidence now suggests that the environment that they were trying to do the experiment was way different than would have been the environment on the early Earth. And so it has been totally discredited by evolutionists, even though they continue to quote it as saying, well, they couldn't do it, but somehow it could still happen. But second of all, what they create is not a protein, it's an amino acid, which is a building block for the protein. It's only a very small part. And the proteins are, like hundreds of amino acids, the most simple of the proteins. So let me even start with the assumption, an incredibly dubious assumption, that all the amino acids somehow were formed by themselves, which again, there's no explanation by an evolutionist of how that could happen. But let's say even that could have happened. You have all 20 amino acids that exist for life, and all of them do exist, and nobody knows how they came into being. But even then, that doesn't answer the problem, because how do you get the amino acids to come together to form a protein? Because science has demonstrated that the most simple single cell consists of thousands of proteins, but it also shows that in living cells today, in all our experiments, amino acids are not drawn together to form proteins. They have to be put together by those machines we just saw, the DNA. They don't come together later. So the key is they're not drawn together. But even let's say they are drawn together. Now here's these assumptions that go against this. Somehow we've got from chemicals to amino acids, which there's no answer and it's impossible to happen. But I'll give you that. And then we'll say that sometime in the past amino acids were drawn together, even though they're not now, but sometime in the past we'll even give you that. Now, what's the chance that the amino acids would come together and somehow by accident form a protein? Now, again, I can try to explain that. Let's go to a video. He's going to do better than I will. Now, before you do this, I want you to realize they're going to talk about chances. Mathematicians say that anything outside of 10 to the 20th power is mathematically impossible to happen. All right, so now let's talk about the chance of a single protein happening by accident, even if you have amino acids, which you don't have.
These proteins consist of one or more chains containing hundreds or thousands of individual amino acids. Biologists have compared the 20 different amino acids used to build protein chains to the 26 letters of the English alphabet.
Alphabetic letters can be arranged in a huge number of possible combinations, and it's the sequential arrangement of the letters that determines whether you have meaningful words and sentences. If the letters are arranged correctly, you'll get meaningful text. But if they're not arranged correctly, you'll get gibberish. And the same principle applies for amino acids and proteins.
There are at least 30,000 distinct types of proteins, each made of a different combination of the same 20 amino acids. They are arranged, like letters, to form chains, often hundreds of units long. If the amino acids are sequenced correctly, then the chain will fold into a functioning protein.
Proteins are arranged in such a way that their amino acids collapse on one another and form an architecture that's pre-programmed by the hundreds of amino acids along the protein chain. So the order of those amino acids inside of a protein is essential to getting the right shape.
This arrangement is critical, for if the amino acids are incorrectly sequenced, a useless chain forms, and instead of folding into a protein, it will be destroyed in the cell. As science reveals the intricate construction of proteins, origin of life researchers are confronted with a difficult question. Could amino acids floating in a primordial ocean have arranged themselves into protein molecules through purely random interactions?
Obviously, it is very difficult to imagine how in the primordial oceans the amino acids could organize themselves one after another into the right sequence to form even the simplest protein. And a good way to think about this is to think about the English language and how difficult it would be to string together a meaningful English sentence by randomly placing the letters one after another.
As an illustration, consider the difficulty of forming just one line of Shakespeare's play Hamlet by dropping Scrabble letters randomly onto a tabletop. Only one of 26 possible letters will work correctly at each of the 30 sites in the phrase. The probability of successfully assembling Shakespeare's classic line by pure chance is determined by computing 1 over 26 to the 30th power. The result is a staggering 1 chance in 2,810 trillion octillion. Yet while these odds are beyond comprehension, they seem almost reasonable when compared to the probability of randomly forming just one of the simplest protein molecules known to science. The smallest proteins in nature are comprised of about 100 amino acids. These chemical components must align in specific positions along a chain. Biologists have estimated that on a planet covered by a primordial soup, filled with complete sets of all 20 types of amino acids, the time necessary to construct a functional protein of 100 units would be roughly equivalent to the oldest estimated age of the universe, multiplied by 10 to the 60th power. But despite this inconceivable time frame, even if our protein somehow correctly self-assembled, the mystery of life's origin is still far from resolved.
Let's just say that against all odds, against everything we know about science, you do get 100 amino acid long protein by chance. What do you have? Well, you have one protein. That's it. We don't have life because even the simplest cell requires over 600 proteins in order for it to be functional, in order for it to be alive. So mainstream scientists no longer think that life and the building blocks of life could originate by chance. They're now looking for a way to explain the building blocks and explain life's organization by some form of law or combination of laws that would allow that to happen. Chance is no longer an option.
And you see how incredible, why did God make it so complicated? It could have been, God could have made life with the simple atom that we thought, but God made it complicated because he wanted us to look, and when we finally figured out how to look that deeply, to be amazed. And to look at it and to say, that clearly creation is pointing us towards God. Again, the chances of one protein being formed are so incredibly beyond impossible, but that's one protein. You need 600 different proteins to get the simplest cell, and then they need to come together and somehow build the machines that they do. And what you have is you have Darwin or evolutionists that are basically saying, we acknowledge it's impossible. How do they try to answer it? You have a guy like Richard Dawkins, who comes up with something called the anthropic principle. Let me get that right. And what he's saying is basically, it's impossible, but it happened, so we must be really, 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 really lucky. And that's his explanation. He knows that it's impossible to have happened, but you know why he says we must be really lucky? Because he's already excluded the possibility of God. God isn't an option, so therefore we're not looking at it and saying what is more reasonable, that we are designed by a creator or that we happen by chance. God isn't an option, so therefore the only option is that we happen by chance. And I know that the science tells us it's impossible to happen by chance, but since God's not an option, that's the only option left. If you remember back, a couple weeks ago, we did a quote from a guy named Lowenstein, and here's what he said. An evolutionist, he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its contracts, in spite of its failure to fulfill the extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Here he was saying, we know it's impossible. But we believe in science not because the evidence points us there, but in spite of the fact that all the evidence says it's impossible, because we've excluded the possibility of God, and we've concluded from the beginning, before we look at the evidence, that we know that we've evolved. We know that matter is all that exists. And so he continues on. It's not that the methods and institution of science somehow compel us to accept a material phenomenon for the phenomenal world. On the contrary, we are forced by our arbitrary adherence to the material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, and we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. You hear what he's saying? That's what we're seeing. That little comic in the beginning, it's the evolutionists that say, we know, and we're going to just shut our eyes to all the evidence. And even though we acknowledge it's impossible, we're going to say, well, we still believe the impossible because we have a faith in materialism. We've rejected the possibility of God. All the evidence says this points to design. And we're going to ignore the evidence, and we're going to go to everything in evidence is saying is false. Now, believe it or not, it actually gets worse. You can go we're just talking about the cell and the formation of life. Because it's not only about, here we're talking about the complexity of the cell, we're talking about proteins. What we're finding is that it gets even more complicated when you look at now in DNA. We didn't understand DNA before. But here's what's happened. See, the scientists, when they try to talk about the formation of life, they focus on questions of matter and energy. Could somehow organic matter somehow randomly organize itself into complex biological structures? Could proteins become amino acids? Could amino acids somehow become, or could chemicals become amino acids and those become proteins? Even though it's impossible, we still want to believe it. And so well then somehow this life becomes, a single cell becomes the complexity we see. Again, there's no evidence for it. But here's what's happened. As we look deeper into life and we discover DNA, what we find is that life is not just a matter of matter and energy. It's also of information. You know what DNA is? DNA is the most complicated, complex, storage of information. To put another way, it's saying, okay, even if you believe that a computer somehow could have evolved itself and you have the hardware, you still need the software to run it. Where did the software come from? Where did information come from? Because what we're finding is that information is at the heart of life. And you know what? Every time we experience, have you ever run across information that came from nowhere? No. Information always comes. It can't come from random biological processes. Information always comes from a mind. There's no evidence of any time that any information can somehow create itself. It always comes from a mind. So what do we know with now, DNA? I mean, DNA is this incredibly complex structure where literally, if you want to know the simplest form of DNA that we know of, they say the simplest form of DNA, if you were to try to transcribe it and write it down, it's 30 volumes of an encyclopedia. And when you understand DNA, if you get one letter wrong, it literally is 4 letters that are organized. If you get one letter wrong, the whole thing doesn't work. That's where you get diseases. That's where you get death. And so you have 30 volumes of encyclopedia. Now, they've used this illustration before. Can you believe that this happened by chance? Now, here's what I want you to realize is that when you have DNA, now you're talking about information. And now it's not just a question of if 2 lines can put themselves together by chance. The DNA is thousands of pages. Thousands of pages that have to be done. It's not just 2 lines, it's thousands of pages, and they have to be perfect. And some people say, well, the thing is, what happened is like one person's explanation, if you give me 1 billion monkeys typing over 1 billion years, sooner or later they're going to get it right. Well, that's the assumption that if one gets one letter, then if one gets a page, well, you take that page out and you hold it. No, it's one monkey. He has to get all 300 volume or 30 volumes accurate. It has to be done perfectly to form one strand of DNA. And that one strand of DNA, somehow information that comes from nowhere, that absence of life somehow creates information which we know can't exist. But even if you look at it this way, it's not only a problem of saying, how did it create the information, but where did the letters come from? The letters have to spontaneously produce themselves. I mean, when you look at this, it's impossible. So much so that Francis Crick, the designer of the DNA, here's what he said. Here's what he said about it. He's looking at this and he says, biologists must consistently keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. You know what he's saying? As a biologist, I have to remember that I have to totally ignore all the evidence, and I have to believe what I decided before I started looking at the evidence. All the evidence is telling me this is designed. This could not have happened by accident. But I have to ignore the facts because I've committed to myself into believing something even before I look at the facts, and I'm going to take a blind leap of faith in spite of the fact that everything tells me it's wrong. See, we believe that we are created, and Scripture is consistent with that. You have guys like Francis Crick. He's one of the people. You have Stephen Hawkins. You have different versions of this. These really intelligent people. They have concluded that because life is so impossible, they have these new theories called panspermia. They believe that because life could not have started here on Earth by chance, there must have been aliens that somehow brought life. That's Francis Crick. That they sent spaceships here to bring life to us. And Richard or Stephen Hawkins thought that no, there's life on another planet that blew up, and somehow some of the single cells survived and somehow made it to Earth and landed in an asteroid and started life. And now what evidence is there for that? None. In fact, we're going to see that next week that the chance of life starting on another planet is incredibly remote. But you know why they believe it? Because there's less evidence disproving it. There's no evidence for it, but there's so much evidence proving that what they're trying to teach is wrong. So here, let's make up something that is so wild that can't be disproven. Why? Because we cannot believe that there is a God. So let me close by asking you a couple questions. Number one, does the evidence of science point us towards faith in God and creation, or towards chance and evolution? And the more we get into this, the more I think that it's not even close. I mean, there are people that sincerely believe in evolution, friends of mine, but that's where you look at it and you say, you've got to believe it in spite of the fact. If you really want to be open, if you really want to be a thinking person and have a reasonable faith, Everything in science is pointing us towards a designer, towards a creator, towards God. It all agrees with Genesis 1. And it all just totally disagrees and disproves the theory of evolution. But the second question that I want to ask you is this. Have you moved beyond the facts to a relationship of faith with God? See, because again, it's not just a matter of saying, well, I know there's a creator and I believe that. You see, God gives us the Bible and he gives us science to tell us that he exists. But not only that he exists, but that he wants a relationship with us. The Bible teaches not that God created the heaven and the earth and then has left it to itself. We're going to see as we come to the reminder of Christmas, that Christmas is about now God being with us. Emmanuel, God with us. God coming into human form, into human history, to redeem us, to seek a relationship with us. You see, I hope that you're amazed by what you see through creation. I hope that you are drawn to a faith in God. See, but it's a faith that goes beyond, it's consistent with reason, but beyond reason. Saying, I not only believe God, but therefore, because there's a God who seeks after me, and the Bible tells that story, you see, I've got to go from believing about to believing in, of trusting my life to him. So the story of the Bible is that God created us, but we fell because of our sin, and because of our sin, we're separated from him. But Jesus Christ came so that we could be restored. Our sins could be forgiven through what he did on the cross, and we could be given a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And I'm not only asking you here, do you believe in God? Do you believe in the evidence that is so amazing of creation? But if you acted on that belief and moved it from intellectual to, I trust my heart, and I want that relationship with him. If you never have, he's calling you to do so today. And I hope that this morning before you leave, that you'll talk to me, you'll talk to somebody, talk to Gary, you'll talk to, give us a call this week and say, even there where you're at, God, I agree with you, I'm a sinner. And I thank you for pursuing me, for not just creating in me and leaving me on my own, but for pursuing me through Jesus Christ. Forgive my sins, and he will. I hope and pray that today that we will be amazed by God. And as we are amazed by him, we will see his amazing creation, not only reminding us of an incredible God, but one who calls us into relationship with him. An incredible God that we can not only worship and admire, but that we can know. Isn't that a great, great truth?